Okay, thank you. What button? Oh, which button? Hey, I just want to set my timer just for a moment. If you'll bear with me just a moment. I'm young, but I'm not technologically savvy. Which one is it? Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenvi Phillips, and I am the Curator for Race and Ethnicity at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe Institute, Harvard University. And I want to first thank the staff at Moorland-Spingarn, the staff at Howard University Libraries, Dr. Shirley Moody, Adrena Eiffel. I think Penn State, y'all brought this project together. Of course, my institution for sending me, and also Dr. Lopez Matthews for organizing this wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I'm looking forward to having a further conversation with our esteemed panelists, including my mentor and advisor, Dr. Clark Lewis. I'm super excited for this conversation. It's very timely and very important, as Dr. Moody has already said in her presentation, which is pretty great, in talking about the ways that we can use the collections in a digitized form, and also the ways that we can use collections even in their physical form. But I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about my job, my role as Curator for Race and Ethnicity at the Schlesinger Library, and what it actually means to actually value these collections, and what it means to preserve them and keep them in the first place. So let's step back from digital and just go to the simple fact of making sure that we hold on to these stories and making sure that we have something to digitize for the future. So the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library, let me get it right. The Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library for the, just stop. The Schlesinger Library, please forgive me, please forgive me. The Schlesinger Library, oh, that's not gonna look good. The Schlesinger Library is 75 years old this year. So that means in 1943, one of our former alums, Maud Wood Park, who was a former female reformer and suffragist, gathered her collections, gathered her books, gathered her memorabilia, gathered her information about the suffrage movement, much like Jesse Moorland gathered his information in 1914 to establish what was the Moorland Foundation, became the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center. She gathered her materials and donated it to the school, the Radcliffe College, to make sure that there was a place to hold the work and the writings of these women who were working for equality for women generally. Now, the women that they collected were largely wealthy, largely white, well-educated women, and they were actually a marginalized group. We're talking about bringing people out of the margins. We're talking about making sure that there's a group of people who had not been valued, whose works have been underrated, even though these are reformers. These are women who are working in the abolitionist movement, who then worked in the suffrage movement. They are making changes in our society, but we want to make sure that they kept them. So Maud Wood Park actually started our collections, and we worked to make sure that we had this marginalized group, which for about 40 years largely meant wealthy white women. And in the 1970s, when our discipline decided, and scholars and researchers and historians said, you know what, there are a lot of people who are missing. There are a lot of people whose stories we don't know, whose perspectives we haven't respected, whose experiences we are missing in our American narrative. We need to get those stories. And we came up with, or we began to see the value in the oral histories. So along the 1960s, 1970s, we said, let's start talking to people. Let's start finding out from themselves. These are individuals who may or may not have kept diaries, who may or may not have kept records. You know, Anna Julia Cooper is special and somewhat unique in that she wrote and held papers where average women, ordinary women, women who were housewives, who were mothers, who were domestics, who did not have time to keep a diary. Let's talk to them. Let's find out what they were doing and how they were doing it. So in the 1970s, the Schlesinger Library embarked upon what became the Black Women's Oral History Project. And over 75 women from around the United States, African American women who were change agents, who were local activists, who were local leaders, who were professionals. There are lawyers, there are doctors, there are educators, there are housewives, there are bankers that came together. They said, let's talk, let's sit down, and let's find out about your story. And so these 75 different women, it seemed to be like a novel thing. Like all of a sudden, oh wait, they do have a story. Oh wait, they do have something to say. And oh wait, they do have a face. They do have a name. They do have lives and husbands and children and so forth and so on. And so it became such a hit. There was a photographer who saw and said, oh, I want to take their pictures, because not just their voice, but also their face. I want to take their pictures. I want to see their names. And the project has been transcribed. The project, and there's a wonderful booklet that was produced to go along with these women. And among those women, there are people who are alums of Howard, so Dorothy Farabee, who was a medical doctor here, Polly Murray, who is graduate from the law school. There's Dorothy West, the author who wrote The Wedding and various other Harlem Renaissance novels and fiction. And they have these wonderful, vibrant stories. And actually, our Black Women's Oral History Project is available online at our website, and you can hear their voices. And if you go and you hear Dorothy West, who has this wonderful, wonderful energy, like she's kind of on fire. She's talking and she's all over the place. And at one point she talks to the woman who's interviewing her, and she's like, I'm tired, so we're gonna have to sit down. And 15 minutes later, she's still talking about whatever she was talking about. She has all these wonderful insights, and she gives this wonderful look into the Harlem Renaissance. We get to hear about who's dating who and who's talking to who. And so all of those things, those backstory things that may or may not have been written down, we have that story, and those things are being put forward. And so it was a great project. And actually, some of the people whose papers that they talked to, like Dorothy West, her papers are at the Schlesinger Library. They talked to Rosa Parks. Dorothy Farabee's papers are here. Flemmi Kittrell, who was a home economics, the first woman PhD in home economics, her papers are here in Moorland, but they talked to her as well. And so some of those women, there's a physical record somewhere. But here we are, 40 years later, and I was recently hired, so I've been working at Schlesinger for about 1.5 years, and 40 years later, we're still saying we're almost, I don't want to say a crisis moment, but there's a urgent need to make sure that somebody is focusing on pulling women out of the margins. My official title was Curator for Race and Ethnicity, so we're talking about making sure that those marginalized groups, start with white women who are marginalized, let's pull them toward the mainstream, but we're still looking at those ethnic groups, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, American. Let's move all of these women closer to the mainstream argument. So we want to talk about how are we doing that and why are we doing that still. So even with Dr. Moody's wonderful presentation of the things that we can do, so I'm assuming everybody in this room understands the importance of what's done and what can be done, but there's still a need to make sure that everybody understands that all of these voices are valid and all of these voices are important. So as I've mentioned, we have Dorothy West's papers, we have Florence Kennedy's papers, we have June Jordan's papers. So we have a nice base of women, but there's still room. There's still gaps. There's still individuals whose voices and whose stories that need to be told to bridge those gaps that we have in our collections and in collections around the United States. One of the questions that I get as a curator for race and ethnicity at a predominantly white institution is, why should we take Black women's papers and put them at a place like Harvard? Like, why should we do that? I just gotta look, so I have the answer. And my answer quite simply is, that our stories are so important. Our stories are so nuanced and so complex, and we are in every walk of life. I think about people like June Jordan, who had a complex and multifaceted definition for herself, and she often rejected the kind of singular acceptance into this organization or into this movement or into that movement. She said, I'm not going and joining the feminists because I'm not simply a feminist. I'm not simply a woman. I'm not going to go solely with the Black Power movement because I'm not simply Black. I have all of these different pieces to myself, and I refuse to reject any one of them. And so in respecting the complex lives of the women that we are whose stories we're collecting, there is a place for us everywhere. As Black women, there's a place for us everywhere. You think in terms of folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, who relatively recently coined the term intersectionality, or you think about where Frances Beale was talking about in the 1970s and the double burden, or the double jeopardy and the double burden of being a Black woman. If you think in terms of what Anna Julia Cooper was talking about when she said, when and where I enter, because she's encompassing all of the issues and all of the things that everyone has to consider. Black women have all those things, so why not put them in conversation with collections everywhere? When you talk about feminists and we talk about how are Black women moving in the feminist movement, so how do Black women, Florence Kennedy, how does she converse with Betty Friedan? Both of those collections are at Schlesinger. And it's nice for researchers to be able to say, let's put those women in conversation and make sure they talk. That's if you think in terms of the lawyer. So Florence Kennedy is also a lawyer. So she's not just a feminist, but she's also a lawyer. You think in terms of folks like June Jordan, who's a poet, who's also an activist. You think in terms of folks like our most recent acquisition, Angela Davis, who is a scholar, who is an activist, who is she's got a lot of things. You all know her. You all know her. So how do we put her in conversation with some of these other big name change agents and folks who are moving our society forward? How do we make that happen? And my second answer to that question is that everything Black can't come to Howard. It's just not enough room. It's just not. It's not enough room. It's not enough room, and so we have to kind of spread the love and spread the wealth. We just have to. I know, Lopez. Give me a second. So. And then so finally, as I'm thinking in terms of how we fill the gaps, how we move to talk about Black women's experiences and how we make sure that Black women's experiences are talked about widely, not just as Black women, but as individuals, as citizens of these United States. We have to make sure that we value what they're saying. We have to make sure that we're in conversation that's most complete and most complex as humanly possible. And I'm going to sit down.